Welcome to the Industrial IoT Spotlight, your number one spot for insight from industrial IoT thought leaders who are transforming businesses today. With your host, Eric Walenza.
Welcome back to the Industrial IoT Spotlight podcast. I'm your host, Eric Walenza, CEO of IoT1, the consultancy that helps companies create value from data to accelerate growth. And our guest today is Malcolm Hawker, Chief Data Officer of Profisee. Profisee is a cloud-native master data management solution that helps enterprises solve data quality and data governance issues. In this talk, we discuss the challenges related to data management, from integration between systems to standardizing workflows. We also explored how blockchain can impact data governance by making it easier to manage data sharing between supply chain partners. If you find these conversations valuable, please leave us a comment and a 5-star review. And if you'd like to share your company's story or recommend a speaker, you can email us at team@iot1.com. Finally, if you have an IoT research, strategy, or training initiative that you'd like to discuss, please email me directly at erik.walenza@iot1.com. Thank you.
Malcolm, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you, Eric, for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, great. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. We're a company that focuses very much on helping our clients discover how to make use of data. So it's a topic that I wrestle with all the time. And I think it's, obviously it's the topic that you focus on at Profisee today, but it looks from your CV that you've also covered this from a number of different perspectives as an analyst at Gartner, architect at Dun & Bradstreet, senior director of IT at Neustar. So there's 7 or 8 kind of senior leadership positions that you've had in your career that have all touched on data from different perspectives. What is the bright line that brought you through that career to the position you're at today as head of strategy at Profisee?
Yeah, the kind of the through line there is a few different things. One, and this may sound pithy, but one, I really like working with companies to help them solve really, really difficult problems. The harder the problem, the more attracted I am to it. That's kind of been the through line of my career. When it comes to data, there's maybe a bit of a sadist in me that really, the harder the problem, I'm going to run towards it. And there's a lot of problems in the data world. We can certainly talk about that. There's a lot of challenges in the data world. But what makes it a little perplexing for a lot of companies is that on the surface, those problems often seem rather simple, right? You're looking at data and you see two things that one says Jeff Smith and the other one says Jeffrey Smith, right? And you think, oh, okay, well, they're probably the same person. Well, are you sure? Right? And why do you have two different records for the same person that kind of looks, maybe they're the same, but maybe they're not the same. You're not 100% sure. That's one tiny little example of a data-related challenge that companies actually really struggle with. So somebody outside the data space could look at that and say, okay, well, that doesn't really look that hard. And how hard could that be? Or how hard could it be to make system A talk to system B, or these types of things? But solving these challenges is really kind of all what I'm about. It's all in my DNA, and it's been the kind of the through line through my entire career, whether I was kind of running an IT organization at a $2 billion publicly traded company, or whether it was as a consultant, an independent consultant, or whether it was working for a software company that was selling solutions to these problems. The through line has been working with large companies to help them kind of figure out how to turn data from a liability, which it often is for most companies, to an asset, right? The whole idea here is to make data the new oil, right? Become data driven, use data as a lever to competitively differentiate yourself from your competitors. That's really been the consistent theme of my career over at least the last 20, 25 years.
Yeah, that's a good perspective, because when data is first collected, whether from consumers, from sensors in a factory, you're right. It really first is a liability. It's sitting in a data center, and it has IP implications, it has privacy implications, cybersecurity implications, and so it's basically a liability, but it also has value. So that's a great way of kind of viewing the challenge here. How do you convert from a liability to a challenge? When we were chatting earlier, you mentioned that at Gartner you've reviewed something like 1,500 companies related to data management over the past few years. So it's a very complicated landscape of companies that are addressing this challenge. How do you, as in your previous role as an analyst, how do you segment that? How do you look at the different jobs to be done in data management?
Yeah, there's a lot of work there, believe it or not. And the story that I tell, at least from a data perspective, is I work in the engine room, right? Like we work in the world of data management, which for a lot of companies sits in an IT organization, generally under a CIO or some CDO, Chief Data Officer, increasingly so. When we look at kind of the world of data management and data related challenges, we can break it down into a few different pieces, right? One of them is data integration, right? Getting data from system A to system B, or getting, the example I used before was making systems talk to each other. The easiest way to have two systems to talk the same language is to have their data be consistent across them, and they can be easily consumed across them. So the world of data integration. Another world is data quality, right? How do you make sure that the data that is being viewed in a system or viewed in a report or used by your end customers is trustworthy, consistent, accurate, unique, or all the attributes of data quality? Another world is this thing called master data management, which is what Profisee does for a living. Master data management solves for the proverbial single source of the truth, right? If I'm looking at two records, Jeff Smith and Jeffrey Smith, how do I know which one is accurate, right? And can I create what's called a gold master record that is used around the organization to make better decisions or to make reports more accurate? So there are other worlds. There's BI, there's analytics, business intelligence and analytics, right? The creation of reports. There's data science, most certainly, for a lot of large organizations now. So when you kind of put all these, there's metadata management, which is kind of the data about data. We're so specific in the data world, we even have a unique world that describes the data about data. And there's most certainly data governance, which is the policies and procedures that relate to your data. How long can you retain it? Where do you archive it? Who can create it? Who has the rights to see the data? What are the rules related to how you define data objects? What are the rules for how you define relationships that may exist within your data, hierarchical type relationships within your data? So all of those things together kind of define the world of data management. And it's people like me and other kind of data professionals that try to figure out the tough answers to those questions of how to make all of that stuff work and how to make it all kind of seamless within an organization so that the organization is making good decisions and that it's fully and completely optimized from an operational perspective, because everything every company does, every application, every business process, every piece of the manufacturing process, every piece of the supply chain, it's all running on data. And if any of it's wrong or bad, you're making wrong decisions. You are operating suboptimally, or maybe the manufacturing plant even just shuts down entirely. So data is the lifeblood of all organizations and all companies, and making sure that it's accurate and trustworthy and consistent and well governed and is deeply integrated across the organization is what I do for a living.
Yeah, great. Okay, great. So that gives us a good background. Maybe we can drill here then into the area where you're focusing on, that source of truth. Maybe one starting point would be, what kind of data are you working with? Are you working with more traditional database data where it's kind of tagged and so forth? Do you also work with data that might be in a data lake, or kind of unstructured data? So is there a scope around the data sets that you might be working with?
Yeah, so not all data is created equally, right? And master data is kind of the high level acknowledgement that data that is shared widely across the organization needs special care and feeding, right? So the quintessential example is data related to your customers. So pretty much everybody is going to be working with customer data in some way, shape, or form, right? Sales is going to be using customer data to build sales proposals. Marketing very obviously is interested in customer related data. What do they want? What do they not want? And on and on. Manufacturing even cares about customer data because they're trying to meet customer needs. So customer is kind of a thread, a data element, a data object, as we call it, that is used widely and is shared widely across the organization. So when data is shared widely across an organization, it needs to be consistently governed, meaning it has to have consistent business rules. At the core, even things like definitions. How do I define a customer, right? Marketing may want to call it a customer one thing, and finance may want to call a customer something else completely. And resolving those differences, or maybe even embracing those differences, but at least acknowledging them and managing them. So master data is data that is shared widely across the organization, but it's not all data. It's actually finite. It's things like customers, suppliers, locations, assets, materials, other data points and other data objects that are used widely and need to be managed in a more consistent way and need to be deeply integrated across the workflows and processes and systems that are all consuming that data. What I just described to you is called master data. And again, it needs special rules because it is shared widely. There's other data in the organization that may just exist within one application, right? That we would not consider that master data. It may be very, very important. It could be critically important data for a specific business process, but it's only if it's only used by one department or one area or one database or one table, it doesn't have to have rules that are defined and managed collectively across the organization, right? So this is where we draw a line between kind of what's considered master data, what's not master data. What Profisee does is sell a software solution, a platform to manage that master data, where you can have consistent rules for the management of that data, where you can allow that data to be deeply integrated across the organization, have consistent governance, quality standards for that master data. So not all data is created equally. There's a unique subset of data that's called master data. It needs specific rules and special rules so it can be used widely across the organization. At a really, really high level, if your CEO asks, how many customers do we have? There can really only be one answer. And that's kind of this idea of a single version of the truth. At a higher level within the organization, CEO, CFO, there really only can be one answer to that question. And that's what master data really helps with.
Yeah. Okay. I got it. Maybe we can use my company as kind of a microcosm here.
Sure,
We're probably the simplest possible company as a boutique consultancy, right? So
yeah,
you could think we have our CRM. Data is relatively well structured there, but still we have duplicates. Somebody goes to a meeting, meets somebody, puts them in, and that person's already been there. So now we have a duplicate. And then we might pull that out into an email tool for sending our newsletter. We pull that into an event an event management tool for managing our community. So all of a sudden we have people in different tools. Even though we're quite a small company, we already have an issue with managing that data. So if we simplify it, what would using Profisee look like for that set of challenges? Just dealing with this, the customers and people related to customers.
Yeah. So one thing to keep in mind, MDM is both master data management is both a noun and a verb. It's both a thing you can buy from us and many others that are also on Gartner's Magic Quadrant for MDM. So it is a software platform. It is a software solution, but it's also a way of managing data. It is a discipline. First and foremost, MDM is really a discipline. So for relatively small companies, from a software perspective, probably overkill, right? Like MDM solutions will be tens of thousands of dollars as a starting point, and they can go quickly up from there. Typically, what we would see is by the time a company kind of hits a certain revenue point, there's no magic number here, but generally at least several hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue where companies start to get relatively big, where the cost from a manual data management, it starts to get excessive, right? Because for a company like yourself, where you've got kind of discrepancies across systems, or where there may be a handful of records within your CRM that really kind of don't align to what's going on in an ERP system or some sort of revenue recognition system, you can manually address those, right? And your entire organization isn't going to be crippled by that, and it's not going to be entirely slowed down by that. You'll still be doing things that align to MDM as a discipline. You'd put in some policies, for example, that could say, hey, here are standards for customer naming, right? Or here's what you need to do to make sure that you don't create duplicate contacts in our CRM. There's processes and policies that you could put in place that tend to be fairly manual, but at least would help address that situation. Or here's what you do when you do encounter a duplicate, right? You don't delete the old one, maybe you just create a new one, or whatever the rules are that are going to work best for your organization. For relatively small companies, that's how they'll solve that problem. Maybe they'll create some separate spreadsheet where it's some sort of new master that is sitting outside the CRM, or whatever the policies are that are going to work best. Again, for relatively small companies, they're probably going to manually solve those problems. But once companies get to a certain size, the problem that you described can become incredibly onerous and can slow down lots of different operational processes. A good example would be maybe a customer service rep is using that exact same CRM system, and a customer calls in with an issue and wants to open a trouble ticket. And the customer service rep says, okay, thank you. Who do you work for? Well, I work for Acme Incorporated. They do a search in their CRM for Acme Incorporated, and they find 15 Acme Incorporated, right? And they'll be like, okay, which one is the right Acme Incorporated? I see 15 of the same records here. I don't know which of these records to associate this trouble ticket with. I don't know which of the ones to look at if I want to see the customer service history of this entity that is calling me and needs my support. So when a company gets to a certain size, these issues related to data can be really, really impactful and can slow down a customer service experience or hinder a customer service experience. They can hinder a manufacturing process. So once companies typically get to this size and they start to realize that they can't throw more manual processes at the problem, they can't just kind of keep throwing bodies or processes and procedures at this. They'll inevitably turn to leveraging software like a Profisee to try to automate for some of these solutions. Because a Profisee can look in and see that, oh, listen, you've got 15 Acmes here. Let's configure some basic business rules so that your CRM agent will only see one. Right, even though you may still be having 15 in the database, but what the agent would see is still one. Or maybe you actually do want to merge those 15 records together into a single version of the truth. There's a lot of different ways to solve for the problem, and these are what's called different styles or implementation styles of MDM. Profisee can support all of them. It really depends on your business need. But where we live is generally companies that are around $200 to $300 million in revenue, upwards to about $3 to $4 to $5 billion. That's kind of Profisee's sweet spot. Kind of beyond $5 billion into kind of extremely large companies. We don't tend to play there very much, at least from a kind of a marketing perspective, a customer perspective. We do have a few very large companies, but kind of our sweet spot is mid-sized companies that are struggling with data, that may be relatively new to MDM, that are looking for a easy to use, fast time to value solution. Those are our kind of sweet spot customers, generally often operating in healthcare and manufacturing or financial services. Those are three verticals where we really tend to shine from a solution perspective.
Mm. Yeah, if we look at those three verticals, do they each have quite distinct challenges, or do the challenges tend to kind of adhere around particular platforms or data sets?
Yeah. Well, at the core, all the problems are consistent, right? At the core, which is that companies tend to become, as they grow and as they become kind of more kind of functionally aligned, right? Where, marketing exists and finance exists. And over time, companies naturally evolve these silos, right? Where the way that marketing does things is different than the way finance does things, and that's natural. So the core problem that exists universally across all companies, whether it's a manufacturing company or a healthcare company, is that data silos tend to naturally evolve, where you will have buckets of data that exist in one system that don't exist in another, or maybe they're even replicated, and you may not even know it, right? Where you've got kind of data that is poorly managed or badly duplicated or inconsistent or inaccurate. These things kind of naturally happen as companies grow. Now, within each of these verticals, there are different words to kind of describe some of the same things, right? In the healthcare space, it's about patient-related data. It's not necessarily customer-related data. There's a different label, but the data looks remarkably the same. A patient is a person, and if you're a B2C company, a customer is a person, and they're both people. Things tend to be a little different from a naming perspective and a process perspective, obviously, in the manufacturing world. But sitting at the core of all of this are these nouns, these core nouns in the manufacturing world as suppliers or vendors for indirect spend, or it is materials, or it's assets, right? In the healthcare world, it's payer, meaning insurance companies. It's providers, meaning doctors and everybody else in large healthcare companies. It's patients and on and on. So a lot of the data looks very, very similar, and a lot of the core business challenges look very, very similar, even though the business processes may differ a little bit, and even though the definitions of things across those worlds may differ a little bit.
Okay. Let me ask a question. Maybe we can get into a few of the differences here. If we look at the programs that you're working with, so CRM, everybody's going to have a CRM of some sort, and they tend to be relatively standardized and fairly consolidated industry. Then if we get into kind of SaaS, for sales enablement or something, all of a sudden we have a proliferation of a lot of programs. They might only be used regionally, et cetera. So a lot less standardization. And so we have that. That's one area of challenge, right? Second area I can imagine here, if we specifically look at healthcare as an example, we have partners, right? So there's a hospital, there's an insurance company. They're both talking about the same person. And so then you have this issue of integration across companies, not just within a company. So that could be another kind of set of challenges between integration. So can you give us just a quick walkthrough of what would be the different platforms? So, CRM, SaaS, et cetera, that you would integrate with? Where are the things that you wouldn't? Like, I don't know, maybe an Excel document, you would say, okay, we're not messing with that. But obviously people store important data on Excel documents. So what's kind of out of scope in terms of systems? And then also, if we look at that issue of data that's internal to your company versus data that's with customers or suppliers or partners that you still need to have aligned.
So by definition, MDM software platforms like Profisee really need to be able to integrate to largely anything, right? So if I was sitting in front of a whiteboard and I was drawing this out, what I'd be drawing is 3 databases on the bottom of the screen, right? The databases could be Excel spreadsheets. Yes, an amazing number of companies still do a lot of critical data management in Excel, or Access. Yes, that still happens. But you'd have multiple sources of data in databases or in tables. It could be an application, could be an individual table, doesn't matter. CRM, ERP, marketing automation systems, procurement systems, HR-related systems, you name it. MDM solutions can consume data or can integrate from just about any source. So typically, the architecture here is you would have a number of sources of data. These would be like the 3 databases on the bottom of the diagram that I would draw. Sitting right over top of those 3 databases, or 4 or 5 or 6 or whatever it is, would be an MDM data hub. So MDM solutions are data hubs. What they do is take a limited, finite amount of data out of source systems, replicate that data, and then persist that data into some form of hub. So we'll take a snapshot of data out of the CRM, we'll take it out of the ERP, we'll take it out of the marketing automation system, out of the HR system, wherever that company needs to kind of virtually at a data level integrate those systems together and to create a common version of the truth. MDM systems will take that data out, replicate it, manage it, and persist it in a data hub. What MDM will then do is look at that and apply some consistent business rules to that data. So this is where data governance comes into play. These are the policies and procedures that you want to apply to this data to allow you to create a single version of the truth. This would even be things like, okay, what are the business rules for resolving differences in duplicates of data? AKA, how do I define uniqueness within, let's say, a B2B record, a record for Acme Incorporated? How do I define and how do I know when Acme is a unique thing, right? MDM has fantastic kind of like these really powerful, algorithmically driven pieces of software that can go and evaluate large sets of data. And we can do things like look and see it's Jeff, Jeffrey, or JJ, or it's Acme Inc., Acme Co., Acme and Son, Acme LLC. And we can figure out if that is one thing or if that's 4 things. And if it is one thing, what we can do then is what we can say, this is a master record. We'll create a new master ID that links all 4 of those source IDs together. We can virtually link them together and continue to persist the source records, or we can actually physically merge those records together if that meets the operating model for the organization. So creating this single version of the truth and persisting this single version of the truth is what MDM is all about. So once you've got that version of the truth, you can use it 2 different ways, right? And it will be sitting there persisted in an MDM hub. So you've got 4 records for Acme Incorporated in the past. Now you've got some new master record, a 5th record potentially, and you could use it 2 ways. One, you could use that to fuel analytics, where you can say as an organization, well, you know what? There's 4 different versions of Acme across all these systems, and we know it. But all we really want to do is to create a 360-degree view of Acme, right? We don't necessarily need to change the source data. We want marketing to continue to manage Acme, how it manages Acme. This is more what we see from large manufacturing companies, where each individual operating unit or division wants autonomy and they want to continue to manage their customer relationships how they want to do it. Where you could say is that I do have a single master record for Acme Incorporated. I want to use it to create a 360-degree view of our relationship with Acme, and I can use that new master ID that is linked to those source IDs to pull back every bit of information across every source, and to create that 360-degree view of Acme, right? So that's one use of MDM, is to create highly trusted, consistent, accurate, high quality, kind of 360-degree views of anything, whether that is an employee, whether that is an asset, a location, in this case, a customer. That's one use of MDM. The other use is what we call more operational styles of MDM, which is once you create that gold master record, you can turn around and push it back into the source systems from where it came, right? So you can actually go from, okay, before I was calling this Acme Inc., but its correct name is Acme LLC, right? And as a system that uses data about Acme, that CRM system, for example, what you could say is that, aha, the data that I had before was incorrect. Now I'm going to use this correct data so that my customer will see their name reflected correctly on the sales proposals. We'll be able to use the correct legal name when it comes to actually recognizing revenue in ERP systems and on and on. So you can use data that is created and managed by an MDM system for better analytics, and you can use it actually into operational systems where you are using MDM as a source of truth for information related to Acme. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Just one clarification. So you mentioned you're kind of pulling a snapshot, and I guess with the first use case you mentioned, maybe pulling a snapshot once a quarter, once a month, what in a reporting
Or
cycle
real time.
is probably but I
Sure.
guess so that would be the question then. Is this done continuously in real time, or is this typically on a schedule? What does that data pull look like?
Yes.
Okay.
It depends. It depends. I can't tell you how many times I've been, particularly as a consultant, you sit down and you start talking about those analytical use cases that I was mentioning, where everybody wants real time. And then you ask and probe a little bit more, and it's like, okay, well, can the applications that would be using this and your reporting systems that are using this even consume data in real time? Well, no, they can't. We actually tend to run our reports on a daily basis. Okay. But if you wanted to run real time, you could absolutely run real time. Once you create, manage, and persist this gold master record in an MDM, MDM systems are very, very good at consuming data from anywhere, and they're very good at publishing data to anywhere, right? So you can be pushing this data out, typically through APIs, typically through RESTful APIs, getting into the technology. You can be pushing, or you could stream it via Kafka or others. You could be pushing that data into a reporting stream. You could be pushing it into a CRM system, and you could do that as often as you want, depending on the business need. So it can be real time. It can be batch. It just depends on the use case. Some of the customer driven use cases where you are using that information. The example I gave was to support kind of customer service inquiries. Maybe you're using that information to make marketing decisions that have to happen real time. Meaning, what ad do I want to serve this person that is coming to our website, or what content do I want this customer to see? That's more of a real-time decision where some sort of digital marketing platform or marketing automation platform would be pulling data out of or polling an MDM and saying, okay, well, who's the customer? What's the customer ID? Certainly more of a real-time use case there. But there's other kind of operational uses of MDM where maybe it's not urgent to have kind of real-time access to that data, and maybe it's more of a batch-driven process. So it just depends on the need. But MDM systems like Profisee can support either use case.
Yeah, let's talk about the stakeholders here. So You've mentioned a couple of use cases. I suppose there's also it feels like there would have to be kind of a human in the loop to quality check or sense check. Are we actually identifying the right identifier? So the question would be, who is owning who's buying this? Who's the buyer? Who's the owner of the system? And then who are the users? From an analytic perspective or from an operational perspective.
Yeah, it's a great question. So typically these solutions fall into some sort of broader data management stack, right? I'd mentioned a few other solutions: data governance, data quality, data integration, BI, analytics. So typically, whoever manages your reporting platform, right? Your Tableaus, your Bursts, your Clicks, or whatever reporting platform, typically that organization is the same one that is managing and maintaining some form of an MDM solution. Again, typically under a CIO or a CDO. What we see so often is that companies will figure out they've got an MDM problem. Often a starting point is problems with reports, right? Well, what we'll see is some executive will get a report and they're looking at a report and they'll see Acme 2 times, right? Or some senior executive is looking at some other data point, and what they see is they know that that data is incorrect, right? Like Acme changed its name last week. Why am I looking at this old data, or why am I looking at inconsistent data? Why do I get 2 different answers for the same question depending on which system the data is pulled from? These things are all kind of indicative of MDM related challenges. So these executives will go to IT and say, hey, IT, my report's broken, fix it, right? And then folks in IT will look at it as like, well, you know what? The reporting system is actually working fine. It's working to spec. It's pulling the data correctly. It's aggregating on the correct keys. Our group buys and sort buys, everything in our analytics platform, it looks great. But then you look at the source data and it's like, oh, we got a problem here in the source data. Like we've got some problems. We've got Acme appearing 2 times, and it probably shouldn't appear 2 times because there's only really one customer here. That screams MDM. So typically the CDO or the CIO will go out, they'll approach a Profisee or other data management vendors and say, hey, I got this problem, can you help? So typically the key stakeholders here are on the what we call the business side of the house, right? It is people within sales or marketing or finance, right? It's people within supply chain, within procurement who are trying to optimize their supplier spends. It's people within in the manufacturing world as well. So anybody on the business side who is in the business of marketing, selling, making anything in an organization, those are the stakeholders of MDM. So these tend to be fairly complex buys from a software perspective. They don't have to be, right? There can be a single stakeholder group. It's common for example, finance leaders to use MDM to have a single source of truth when it comes to managing things like general ledger codes. There can be single stakeholder groups, but typically, by its nature, MDM tends to be cross-functional, right? Because what MDM tends to do is finds and highlights breakpoints between different functions. A classic example is what we see all the time is the way customer data looks in a CRM is different than the way customer data looks in an ERP, because one is a sell to and the other is typically a bill to. And they don't necessarily have to be exactly the same, right? The sell to and the bill to can be the same corporate entity, but maybe different divisions, maybe different departments, and they're both right. But again, you don't want to have 2 different records for Acme Incorporated if there's really only one, or at least you don't want to at higher levels and rolling up and creating these aggregated reports that are going to your CFO or your CEO where you've got 2 different answers to the same question. So stakeholder groups are broad, they're diverse, they can be across the entire organization. They can even include HR, where they've got duplicated employee records. But the internal organization that is deploying and managing these solutions tends to be CIO, CDO. Now, in the middle between all of this, between stakeholders and between IT, these software solutions are pretty smart. They're pretty capable. You had mentioned kind of manual intervention here. Our algorithms are only so good. You were bang on, Eric, in that sometimes human beings do need to intervene here. Sometimes the algorithms will say, we think that these 2 Acme records are the same. We're at a 60 or 70% confidence level that they're the same. But maybe the use case is a financial one or a legal one or a compliance one where 70% is not good enough, right? Where you do need to have a human being review that record. We call that data stewardship. And typically, those data stewards optimally will live on the business side of the house. You will have somebody in sales or somebody in marketing or somebody in finance who knows those business processes and who knows the data relatively well to help with the manual kind of oversight of some of this stuff. Sometimes the data stewards can live on the IT side, but typically they will live on the business side of the house. So there is a collaboration here. MDM is a collaboration between IT and between the business. You need both. You also need both involved in managing and configuring and setting some of these business rules, right? IT will sit down with business stakeholders and say, hey, we want to solve this problem of having 2 different versions of Acme. To do that, we need to have some consistent definitions of a customer. I know this sounds a little crazy, but believe it or not, companies really struggle with having a consistent definition of customer, right? How marketing defines a customer is different than how finance will often define a customer. But to implement an MDM solution, you need to start managing and configuring some of these business rules, right? So this is where some form of a data governance committee will come into play where people will sit down and they'll start talking about things like, how do we define our customers? How do we define our relationships? What data is important to us, right? What data isn't important to us? What are all the various rules for managing this data? If we do create a single version of the truth, who has the rights to update it? And in what system and under what conditions? These are all policies that would fall generally under some umbrella of a data governance committee, some form of data governance policies that need consistent care and feeding. So it's a collaboration. It's IT and it's business stakeholders. Typically, IT is spending the money to solve a problem for the business stakeholders. Once the solution is integrated, it is an active collaboration ongoing that includes care and feeding of data through what are known as data stewards.
Yeah. So this raises another challenging area, which is the topic of managing data across regions. So I'm sitting here in China, which is its own kind of beast, but companies have countless headaches trying to figure out what data they can and cannot move out of China into other markets. I think other geographies also have their own issues, right? So Europe has its own set of challenges around personally identifiable information. How centralized does MDM tend to be? Does it tend to be deployed kind of with a set of rules that are deployed regionally, or do you aim for global rule set with exceptions on an as needed basis?
Yeah, it's a great question. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, MDMs tend to be like those data hubs that I was talking about tended to be kind of deployed on-prem. And you would have a fairly regionalized approach to it based on local data persistence and kind of rules and rules of the road for, like, for example, in Europe or in Germany, if you're managing data related to people, that data needs to persist somewhere. And typically 10, 15 years ago, you would have seen kind of fairly regionalized approaches to solving for this, where data would be persistent where it needed to be persistent. You'd have an instance running in Canada, you'd have an instance running in Germany, and on and on. Now, our solution can still run on-prem if you want. If you want it to run on-prem, there are a handful of our clients that are still kind of running on-prem solutions, but we are fully SaaS enabled now, right? And we can run in pretty much any cloud and support kind of any operational requirement about data where data needs to persist. So from an operations perspective, like there's just kind of like, where does the data actually live? We do have some clients that will have data stored in a US version of a cloud provider or a European version of a cloud provider or other kind of, local instantiations to support, country specific compliance rules. So that's common, but from an operations perspective, we can support any deployment model. Things get more challenging. The centralization versus decentralization issue really becomes more challenging from a business process perspective. Right, the operations and where do the databases actually live? That's the easy part. that's really the easy part here. The hard part is bringing disparate groups together to agree on consistent data management rules. Because what we see, generally historically is, I'll give you a very, very good, recent and poignant example, which was in the manufacturing space. A lot of companies, very, very big companies, had kind of local manufacturing presence, right? They'd be making goods in country A, country B, country C to meeting those local demands, right, and local needs. Well, along comes the pandemic, along comes everything that went with it, and all of these massive supply chain disruptions. And companies then, for a long time, highly decentralized models of managing data and managing manufacturing were working. They were fine. And then they weren't. And all of a sudden, a lot of companies, when this is a lot of the conversations that I had while I was a Gartner analyst, companies would call me up and say, hey, we need to manage our data here a little more centrally because we need broader visibility on the business risks associated with our supply chain, right? We've really been negatively impacted by some of these supply chain disruptions, and we want to continue to operate locally, but at least from a data perspective, we want to do a little bit more centralization of the data so we at least have visibility on what's going on. Before, we were largely kind of driving blind, or it was after the fact, we pulled the reports, everything was fine, but now that model doesn't work anymore. So when you kind of make the jump from highly decentralized ways of working to at least slightly more centralized ways of working, what you find is that it creates a lot of stress fractures in organizations that weren't there before because they didn't have to be there before. You start having to ask questions about, okay, well, how do you create an enterprise-wide definition of supplier or enterprise-wide definition of vendor? How do you create all of the business rules related to data that you need in a more centralized way? That's the hard part. The easy part is figuring out from kind of an ops perspective and database management perspective. That's the easy part. The hard part is figuring out all these business rules. I've talked to a number of kind of senior managers at extremely large kind of global manufacturing companies who were even wrestling with who were kind of hired at a corporate level, who were either a CDO or a CIO or working for a CDO or CIO, who were in these large manufacturing companies were even having difficulty getting access to local data, right? Like let alone even getting to the point of having conversations about having to have a common supplier definition. Even just getting access to data was a challenge. So that's the hard part.
Yeah, great. Yeah, thanks. Makes sense. It mirrors a lot of the headaches that we go through on a weekly basis here at IoT.
I bet.
There's a question a bit out of left field that I just have to throw out there because I know you published a white paper recently or maybe an article on blockchain impact on data governance. Yep. And I mean, it's a fascinating topic. I feel like blockchain was a technology, designed for data governance, and then people figured out that you can gamble with it, and the focus immediately shifted. But there seems to be a real use case for data governance. So, what's your perspective on this?
Well, it's funny. So I published an article recently in Forbes about that. The title of the article was, how blockchain will save data governance. And everything I just talked about, like common supplier definitions or common business rules for managing data, that's data governance, right? And the use case that I described earlier is a perfect example. Large multinational, manufacturing company that is struggling to be a little more centralized, like not entirely centralized, but let's just say a little more centralized, at least from a data perspective. Well, I happen to think that blockchain is a perfect use case for that, right? And the conference I am at right now, I'm sitting in a hotel room in Washington, D.C. I came to this conference to present this idea that I have about how blockchain could be really, really useful in our space. But really, the problem here is not technology. The problem is business process, and really kind of when you peel the onion, the problem here is data sharing, right? At a very, very, very high level, blockchain is fantastic and could be truly transformational in the data governance and the data management space. But to do that, you have to embrace the idea of sharing data across a peer-to-peer ecosystem. Right? In the world of Bitcoin, you want to do that because it's currency, right? And there are network effects that exist when everybody kind of adheres to the same rules of the road, and when everybody agrees that this is how transactions are validated, and this is what a transaction means, and this is what a block means. And if we all act together in the same way and adhere to these same business rules, well, then everything will be more widely adopted. This thing will grow in value and we'll all become gillionaires. That's fantastic, right? In that world. But in the world of business, to create kind of peer-to-peer networks of sharing of data is going to be a real challenge. I still think it will be transformational. I think blockchain will help facilitate these broad data ecosystems. But we got to get companies over the hump of sharing data. I was reading an article recently about an IBM and Maersk joint venture that they had announced a while ago called TradeLens, where they were talking about using blockchain to facilitate kind of data sharing across complex supply chain ecosystems. And at the time, I was actually at the IBM conference. It was called Think. It was in Las Vegas 7 years ago. Where the CEOs of IBM and Maersk actually announced this, and it was like, man, this is awesome. This is transformational. This could be a game changer because of how clunky things are across kind of the logistics, related to global supply chains and shipping containers, and having consistent definitions for shipping containers, knowing where they are and where they start and where they end, and the full lineage, as we say in the data world, the full provenance of any item and where it is in the supply chain. I was like, and full visibility and full transparency that the blockchain can afford. I was like, man, this is going to be a game changer. And then last week, I just learned that they're kind of sunsetting that partnership and giving up on it. So I do think blockchain will be transformational. I do think that kind of the corporate world has a few kind of roadblocks to get over when it comes to widespread sharing of data, because that's ultimately what we're talking about. A blockchain of one is not valuable. right? One cell phone, a person with one phone, with one node on a network is not valuable. The value will come when there are millions of nodes on a network, whether that is a network related to supply chain or whether that's a network related to customer related data or any other network. That's when the real value will come. The only way that we'll get there is when companies realize that for some use cases, not all, but for some use cases, there will be fantastic economies of scale when data is managed in a more shared way and as a shared resource across a complex blockchain-enabled ecosystem.
Yeah, that's the crux. I mean, it does really make sense on paper, but it doesn't necessarily make sense to the lawyers, and they come on and management. And I mean, I guess it's just one of those issues where getting there requires a leap of faith, right? Because you have all these hypothetical problems, and you have to assume that you can solve them. And large corporations are they don't like taking leaps of faith. But it would be interesting to see if maybe there's some opportunities where smaller organizations could kind of lead the way there, and maybe with less sensitive data sets.
Yeah, I mean, and there's plenty of examples of this, of widespread data sharing to facilitate commerce or to facilitate trade that are being done in highly centralized models that I would argue are ripe for disruption, right, through blockchain. A really, really high level example is UPC codes on products, right? Like, it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter what manufacturer you are adhering to this data standard. And the UPC code is a data standard. It is master data. It's everything we've been talking about. It's consistent ways of defining things. It's consistent labeling. It's consistent quality standards. It's consistent structures of data. So that if a consumer goes to Kroger or CVS or Walgreens or Safeway, or it doesn't matter that when you go beep over the reader, you get the same data, right? Like that is a classic example of a data sharing network, an ecosystem where companies have come together and agreed on some data standards, right, to facilitate commerce and to facilitate trade. But it's being done in a highly, highly centralized way. Well, could you do something like that in a decentralized way? And I'm not saying it's necessarily UPC codes. It could be anything. The example I gave before is information related to Acme Incorporated, right? There are certain providers of data that make a lot of money that sell information about Acme Incorporated. They're very, very centralized. They have single databases, repositories of information about companies, or repositories of information about people or about people's needs or behaviors, right? And on and on. And they're all largely centralized, and they're all largely existing as kind of data sharing ecosystems. So companies do see the value here. They get it, right, at a certain degree. But when it comes to, okay, well, you've got to give something to get something, often that's going to be a challenge, and the lawyers most certainly do get involved. As a matter of fact, I'm at this conference here, and I was talking yesterday about smart contracts, and there is a notion in my world, in the data world, of something called a data contract, right, where you could actually even over APIs, where you could actually kind of tag contracts onto your data to say, this is how it can be used, this is what it means, and these are the restrictions of how this data can be used. Right. And I asked a lawyer who was giving a presentation, I said, can you automate that? Because I was thinking about smart contracts on blockchains, right? Why couldn't you automate, the distribution of shared data, or the management of data, or the governance of data, the rules of who can use it and how they can use it? I was like, can you automate that? And the lawyer automatically said, no. I was like, wait a minute. Of course you can. I mean, there's these things called smart contracts, but I figured out why he said no, because I was basically asking, could I automate your job?
Yeah, right.
Right? And anybody's first reaction to that is going to be, no, you can't automate my job. But yeah, I mean, we got a long way to go in the blockchain world, but I think the horse is out of the barn, the cat's out of the bag, pick your metaphor. The technology is too revolutionary. There's too many advantages here. And it always comes back to, I think, economies of scale that can be leveraged through blockchain that don't exist when companies are working, as an island on their own.
Yeah, well, it'll be fascinating to watch this evolve. I think you're right. The technology's there. There's been a lot of experimentation. So we're all waiting for somebody to kind of figure something out and then just build a nice $100 million business. Just kind of figure that out and get some cash flow going. Well, I wanted to then ask maybe if last question here from my side. Maybe there's some other things you wanted to share, but if we look at the future development of Profisee, I mean, is blockchain on the development roadmap? Is this a challenge that you guys will be taking a crack at? And if not, what are the other areas on the roadmap? What are the other priorities?
Uh, we're talking about blockchain, but honestly, in terms of our short-term roadmap, it's not there. All software companies, kind of the road to revolution happens through evolution, right? For at least for existing software companies that have existing customer bases that can't just kind of rip and replace their entire tech stack, right? So we're talking about it. I suspect we will absolutely get there. I think there are some baby steps that we can take to enable this. A great example would be to enable some more widespread sharing across our individual customers, right? I think there are steps that we can take. We're talking about blockchain, but where we're really kind of focused right now is a few different areas. One is really turbocharging the Azure environment. So we're deeply integrated with Microsoft. We've got a long-standing partnership with Microsoft. And we are finding we are working actively to become the default MDM solution provider in the Azure space. Of course, there are others, but we want to be the preferred provider. If you are migrating to Azure, right? If you are doubling down on Microsoft's cloud-based solutions, we want to be your MDM provider of choice. So we are building out and enhancing. We already have an integration into something called Purview, which is Microsoft's data governance tool. It's their kind of a data discovery and data cataloging tool. We already have an integration there. We're continuing to build that out. We've got an integration into Synapse, which is Microsoft's BI layer in the cloud. And we're continuing to work on those integrations, and we continue to try to position ourselves as again the default kind of MDM provider in the Microsoft space. There's a few other things that we're working on that are pretty cool. We are focusing, like so many software companies, on more AI and ML enabled use cases, more AI and ML enabled capabilities within our solution. One is something that we're working on is integrating graph capabilities into what's called our entity resolution, aka matching. The example that I gave before is Acme Inc., Acme Co., Acme LLC. We are working to build out some graph-based capabilities to augment and improve the algorithms that we've got that are running to do what we call entity resolution. Know when something is unique or when it's not unique. I suspect that we will continue to invest in AI and ML and other areas to try to automate more of those stewardship roles that we were talking about, to do things like potentially, like if a data steward, if a human, makes a decision about a piece of data, that decision can be turned around and used to train some ML algorithms so that decision doesn't have to be a human intervened one in the future, right? So that kind of our software can learn from some of the decisions that users are making day in and day out. So those are some examples of some of our kind of 365-day type kind of roadmap, our shorter term roadmap. But we're intrigued with blockchain, most certainly. For our core customers, though, where we are from the kind of the size of company that we work with and the types of companies that we work with, I think we're really kind of 3 to 5 years out before any sort of commercial mainstream applications of blockchain in the data management space. There are more and more blockchain-enabled solutions that are coming, even in healthcare, for things like patient records management, certainly banking in terms of international monetary transfers and foreign exchange and those types of things. So blockchain is gaining speed. Data management, we tend to lag a little bit, and that's okay. But we're certainly looking at it.
Yeah, great, thanks. That sounds like a pragmatic roadmap, right? I mean, you have to focus on where you can, generate value in the foreseeable future here. Great, Malcolm. I think we covered a good bit of territory here. Thanks for your
Indeed.
time. Any last thoughts that you'd like to share with the audience?
No, I mean, this has been a great conversation. Love to do it again. We do kind of work in the IoT space a little bit. One thing that I find really kind of fascinating is this kind of this schism, this break between IT and OT, right? So yes, IoT sensors can exist anywhere. They can exist in vending machines. They can exist just about anywhere, but they're heavily being used on manufacturing floors, right? To optimize what's happening in the manufacturing process. And there's an interesting break between kind of operational technology and information technology, where a lot of the data that exists on the manufacturing floor doesn't really tend to get beyond the manufacturing floor. I've had some interesting conversations recently with kind of thought leaders in the OT world about IoT and about the data that's generating and what they're doing with it. And I asked one of those thought leaders, I said, okay, so you're watching the manufacturing floor and you know everything that's going on. Like these sensors are tracking like literally everything. And I used an example and I said, okay, well, let's imagine that some of the sensors are sitting in a robot arm, right? Like, and you know everything about this robot arm because you have to. And including who manufactured the robot arm, the supplier of that robot arm, obviously a key supplier to your organization. I asked somebody, I said, how would you know, or would you even know if that supplier, the person who sold you that robot arm, was also your customer? And I didn't get a response back. And the person thought about it, and then he said, we probably wouldn't know. Right. And that's the break between OT and IT, right? The world of IT, my world, is like CRM records. It's data and ERPs, data and digital marketing systems, it's procurement systems, it's direct spends, it's indirect spends, it's all of that stuff. And knowing things like what we call balance of trade, meaning you're selling to somebody, but then that somebody is actually even buying from you. Like that's important, right? That is the total relationship that you have with Acme Incorporated, right? You're selling to them, but they're also buying from you. And in the OT world, you have this robot arm that is mission critical to your entire manufacturing process, but you don't know if the company that sold it to you is also a customer. Like fixing for that, like that to me, I think is interesting and relevant. And so I guess kind of a parting thought here would be if there's anybody that's listening to this and is in the IoT world and maybe wrestling or challenged or been given kind of a mandate to figure out, how do we bring these worlds together, so that maybe that we bring the world of direct spend and indirect spend together. Maybe we figure out how do we, bring the world of vendors, the people that are on the indirect side and suppliers on the direct side and figuring this all out and solving for OT and IT. If you're interested in this, I am. So reach out to me on LinkedIn. It would be great to get into deeper conversations on this.
Yeah, awesome. No, maybe that's a follow-up conversation we'll have to have at some point. But
great.
I think IoT data, just looking at that use case, you could also say, well, the data coming off of our production line about your robotic arm is very valuable for your R&D team, right? If we decide to give it to you,
absolutely,
and we probably won't decide to give it to you, but we could anonymize the production data, and we can give you the data that's less sensitive, and there's a lot of value that's untapped there. So lots of areas to explore here on the IoT side. Would love to have a follow-up conversation with you, Malcolm, but really, thanks for the time today.
Thanks so much, Eric. I appreciate it.
Thanks for tuning in to another edition of the Industrial IoT Spotlight. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at IoT1HQ and to check out our database of case studies on IoT1.com. If you have unique insight or a project deployment story to share, we'd love to feature you on a future edition. Write us at eric.walenza@iot1.com.